Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoyed today's session, Working with Landlords, Finding a Good Fit. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Let's go to the housekeeping slide if we could, or if we don't have one, I'll just go over some housekeeping. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there's a control panel in the upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any questions, if you have any technical issues, please raise your hand through the control panel and submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent out to everyone following today's webinar. This brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Lynette Pearl. Welcome back, Lynette. She is the Senior Associate of Housing with Refugee Housing Solutions. And I will go ahead and pass it to you, Lynette.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you for having me back again, especially about something so important about is it a good fit and how to properly vet a landlord. Landlords, they use screening tools such as background checks, credit reports to assist them in finding the right tenant for their property. So why shouldn't an applicant also use tools to screen a potential landlord for credibility and reliability? In this webinar, if you're a sponsor or volunteer, you will learn ways to vet a potential landlord to determine if it is a good fit for your partnering newcomer. Next slide. Again, like Derek mentioned, my name is Lynette Pearl, and I am the Senior Associate of Housing with Refugee Housing Solutions. And Refugee Housing Solutions is a project of Church World Service. We're under an agreement paid for by the U.S. Department of State. Church World Service, as you know, is a faith-based organization working to help communities around the globe with sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. Next slide, please. So how to screen a potential landlord? The screening goal for a landlord is to identify which applicant is in a pool of applicants will most likely fulfill the lease terms and take care of the rental property. So since landlords have a pre-screening process, a tenant should also have one. I want to say this, even though the affordable housing market is very tight and it is very competitive, this should not deter anyone from having a pre-screening potential housing provider. Having a process helps an applicant from entering into a possible disaster rental experience with a questionable landlord. So let's get it right into it. So we're going to go into this section. The first thing, the tips that I'm going to talk about are the things I used to use when I was a housing specialist. The first thing you can do, you can check online reviews, okay? Online apartment reviews and ratings, they are a great way to get more information regarding the property and the potential landlord beyond what's shared on a listing or website. Unfortunately, there are some false reviews out there that can be misleading. So how do you evaluate and utilize apartment reviews to determine if the information is credible? Well, you first need to determine if the reviewer is legitimate. You can click. A reviewer can have negative, positive, or informational motives. So for example, a tenant that has been evicted would possibly write a lethal review. Or you might have an employee that wants to improve the image of the apartment. They would post a glowing review. So the informational motive is the reason why reviews exist. And if a review is overly negative and overly glowing, it could possibly either be a distraught tenant, or it can also be an employee trying to enhance exaggerate the property. So one thing you need to look at when you're looking at a review is to look for like brochure-like language. That could be possibly an employee. One thing you also need to look for is watch out for vague reviews. A vague review with little detail may be the work of a fake poster, sometimes called, we call them review trolls. This person never actually lived in the apartment community. They simply enjoy just posting fake or misleading complaints. So when you look for reviews and you want to look for things specifically, look and see if they're discussing issues like management. Are they talking about the management? Responsiveness? Are they talking about the neighborhood's desirability? And also, are they talking about the pricing of the apartment? Another thing is, are the reviews similar in nature? If there are multiple reviews that are similar in nature and it focuses on the same issue or problem, that's something worth noting. Another thing I used to look for when I was looking at reviews, when I was trying to vet a landlord, was, does the landlord reply? If a review has a response from the landlord with an apology and a possible solution, it does show that the landlord is least responsive and they do care what's being said about their actual community. Ratings, that's another thing you can use. It's common to see reviews at the low or high end of a rating of a star system. So while there are usually fewer scores in the middle, the 3 and 4 star reviews, this tend to be more detailed and objective. So with reviews, again, I want to talk about is key to check the date. An older review can still be provide you insights, but you don't have to, but some things can change since then. So for example, is the property under new management? Have there been personnel changes? Has the property undergone renovations? These changes likely won't reflect in a review that's more than a year old. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind when you're reviewing older reviews. Another thing that you can look at is the listing copied? A common practice housing scammers do, they copy a legitimate listing and word for word in order to make their ad more appealing. So just simply copy and paste the text and do a Google search to see if a duplicate ad comes up with a different company and contact information. Next slide. And as you guys know, if you've been attending any of my webinars, I'm an example type of girl. Here's an example of an actual review. As you can see, it states that it's verified. And again, we're going to look at the year. It's 2025, 2021. So it is a little bit older. It's an older review. But let's take a look and say what they're saying. It says, I lived at the Market Station for the past 2 years in 2 different apartments. Market Station has the amenities, office staff, and maintenance staff are previous apartments I've lived in. There's been multiple instances that the staff has gone above and beyond. So this is one thing you're going to look at. You're going to look at how does the staff respond? How does maintenance respond? That's one thing. Next slide. And here is another review, but it's an earlier review on the same property. It's dated March 28, 23. So we're talking about almost a 2-year span of the reviews. So again, this states great community, maintenance is very responsive. So the reason why I'm using the 2 different dates is because I'm going to try to determine, is what they're saying about this property legitimate? Now, as you can see, like I spoke about earlier, you want to see, are they talking about common things? Is there a common thing in what they're stating about the actual property, which they are? They're stating like 2 years ago, the maintenance staff was great, management staff was great. Okay, so let's fast forward to 2023. You're still seeing the same types of reviews regarding this actual property. So this is a legitimate review. So this is just an example how you can cipher through reviews to determine if it's legitimate. And the reason why I kind of use this particular property, I used to live there, so I kind of know firsthand that is a good property. So all the reviews are legitimate. Maintenance is very responsive. So that's why I use an example for this property. But again, make sure you're looking for key things. Is the maintenance, you're looking at the respond when it comes to maintenance, and also management. Next slide. One of the things I used to do too I used to do online public property search. Part of a landlord's application process is determine if an applicant is financially stable. So why shouldn't an applicant also screen a potential landlord's ownership status and financial stability? This is how you can tell if this is a good fit, because you want to make sure before a newcomer is renting up that this landlord is responsible financially. If a renting apartment is most likely to be foreclosed upon during a tenancy, may be a bad idea. Even if a new owner does allow the tenant to stay, a tenant may risk getting a new owner who is not as conscious as the landlord you originally leased up to. And by doing an online property search, you can find out if they're in the process of also being foreclosed on. So we're going to get a little technical. So when the owner has failed to make a loan or mortgage payment, it's called a notice of default, can be filed in the county where the property is located. Because the information is public, you can search and you can check the notice status through the county records office called the Records of Deeds or Recorder Office, depending on where you live. You can also check the ownership status of the property before leasing with a private landlord. I always did that, especially if I'm about to lease up with a private landlord with a client. It would be a good idea to check their ownership status to prevent being scammed and also rental fraud. There are resources that are available to help verify home ownership. The first one is you can check with the local assessor's office. On your local assessor's office website, you can look up property taxes records and find the property owner by their address. And you can also learn who owns the home and how much property tax they're paying. So if you have a homeowner that is behind on their property taxes, I don't think that's a good idea to possibly try to lease up a client with that particular homeowner. The county clerk's office, it also has public records of property deeds, and also there's useful information when searching for the property owner. Not only will this tell you the owner of a house, but your county record may give you insight into the history of the property. So you can actually see the history of the property. This is very vital, especially if you're dealing with a property management company that's managing the house for a private owner. You can kind of find out truly who the owner is if you have issues with the property management company that's managing for it, and you're like, I want to go straight to the owner. So this is valuable to know. You can also go to your local library. That does vary. They do have a database. You can conduct a property search. This can be available online, or you may be able to find it public records in person. So it does vary. It does vary depending on your local library. I do know that certain libraries in Chicago, you could look up properties. They had a database. A good thing also, you can do a title. You can get with a title company. A title company can research property deeds and perform title searches. Not only will you be able to find the owner of the property, but a title search will check for any issues with the property. But however, using a title company, it does come with the cost for them to run the search. When I was a housing specialist, I found a very legitimate title company. I told them what our mission was, what we did. The population I housed at the time was homeless veterans, so they really bought into our cause and our mission. So they ran titles for us at a discounted rate. So if you do find a legitimate title company, tell them what you're doing. Tell them you're doing good work. We're housing newcomers. Would you like to partner with us? And when we have to do a background check on a landlord to see their credibility, are you willing to do a title search for us at a discounted rate? And usually they will do that if you have a larger title company that will buy into your mission. I want to say it's very important that you do your research, especially when you're dealing with private landlords. Here is a YouTube, and this is an actual example of a Craigslist rental scam. So Grace, can you go ahead and play this video? So, can you guys hear me? Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, I just want to double check. So that's very powerful. Again, I am an example type of person, and so I like to put a face to scenarios. And that was a live case scenario, and you don't want that to happen, especially again with limited amount of funds. You don't want to be scammed, so it's very important that you do your due diligence. Another thing you can do, you can Google the landlord and or property. It may seem obvious, but it is a good idea to Google the owner and even the address. If the property has been in the news lately, like this particular situation, you'll read about it, and chances are the story won't always be positive, unfortunately. Another thing when you're dealing with private landlords, check the criminal history. If a landlord is able to disqualify an applicant for their criminal history, why shouldn't an applicant? Because arrest incidents and conviction records, they are public. You can look up a private landlord's criminal history, but I want to add this disclaimer. However, each state, it does determine which records can be easily accessible to the public, so just FYI. For example, some states may not make arrest records easily available due to it being a prejudice situation. So just FYI. Also with private landlords, apartment complexes, and property management companies, check with the Better Business Bureau to see if there are any types of complaints. Another thing I used to do when I was a housing specialist, I would check for code violations. Even though a title search will allow you to locate the owner of the owner, but it doesn't tell you what is actually wrong with the property. It will not report any past or current code violations on the property or the units. You can check with the local county or city code enforcement department. One thing I would look for too is nuisance violations. That may include, was it litter? Did they get tickets for littering, trash, uncut grass? Were they good on their property maintenance? Were there any property maintenance codes that was made on the actual property? Also, another thing I used to do is the online ad professionally written? An ad with questionable grammar or spelling could be a red flag, so carefully review the rental listing and check for spelling mistakes, odd wording, and overuse of capital letters. Again, I want to put a disclaimer there. There are a lot of great landlords, English are not their first language. So again, this is just a tool, not the end all to be all. So don't use this, okay, oh, the ad has too many caps. Again, you have other screening tools you can use to tell the legitimacy of an actual landlord, because I've had landlords that were great landlords and English were not their first language. So I just want to put that disclaimer in there. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about property classes, how you can use this to actually screen a vet, an actual landlord. Knowing a property class rating can determine if their rent they're requesting is reasonable. That's what I used to use, a property class. And you're just like, what is a property rating? What is a property class? Well, what it is, investors and lenders and brokers, they establish a property classification to communicate easier the quality, the age, and the attributes of the property and the neighborhood location. Properties that are classified as either A, B, C, or D, and these ratings are used across all of the real estate assets classes, just so FYI. So that also includes office buildings, retail centers, industrial and apartment structures. So we're going to break down these classes. So we're going to talk about Class A property. So a Class A property, it is determined by several important physical and financial characteristics, and some attributes totally include but are not limited. It looks at the property's location. Usually with a Class A property, there's going to be a lot of amenities. Also, the age of the property is typically built within the past 10 years. When you look at a Class A property, most of the residents are considered high earners. So we're going to talk about the Class B property. Now, a Class B property, they're typically a little bit older, between the ages of 10 to 30 years old. The income level of the residents' income is probably upper middle class brackets. When you look at the appreciation, it's fair appreciation, but not appreciate as well as a Class A. And some of those properties might need a little bit of maintenance. Next slide. Then we go to our Class D properties. Again, they're a little bit older, usually more than 30 years of age. You're going to have your typical lower middle class residents in this particular property. But the one thing about the thing I want to point out about the Class C properties, they're more popular than Class A and Bs. And the reason why is because of affordability. So your Class C properties are going to be more affordable. Of course, they're going to need a little bit of maintenance, but again, it depends on how much maintenance has been deferred. So I've seen, I'll back that up. So let's go to Class D properties. Again, when you think of D, it's like, oh my God, a slumlord. Again, they're a little bit older because they're the oldest properties you're going to see if they have a Class D properties. Unfortunately, sometimes these Class D properties, income levels of the residents are considered low, 50% below AMI. And depending on the condition, there's going to be a lot of maintenance that needs to be done. With this section, again, I want to put a caveat because I've seen it all, been in housing for many years. I've seen sometimes Class D properties in better shape than Class A properties. Just because something is newer doesn't mean it's better. Again, these are just the basic classifications that they use in the real estate world to classify a property, because it depends on how much capital improvements have been put into the units. So don't be turned off by, if you say, oh, it's a Class D property. Just use this as a guide to say, okay, I do know it's going to be an older building, but if it's well maintained, this gives you some leverage to negotiate the rent. So this is just, again, something as a screening tool, not your end all to be all. Okay, so next slide. Another thing you could do, you could speak with the current residents if you feel comfortable. If you feel comfortable talking to a current resident, approach them. I used to do that. And basically, I would ask some questions like, well, what is your, does the maintenance staff respond to any maintenance issues? How does management, is management very professional? Trust and believe if there's an issue with an actual property, that resident is going to express it to you. But again, just like we talked about reviews, you got to decipher to say, okay, is it a disgruntled person because it seems like they are about to get evicted, or the things they're saying is legitimate? It's legitimate concerns about how management is reacting to maintenance requests. Another thing you can, again, if you feel comfortable, talk about current neighbors or current businesses around the neighborhood of that property. Ask what their thoughts about that particular landlord or that property management company. Just plain old curbside appeal. You can tell a lot from a landlord from the conditions of the property. Good landlords make sure their properties are safe, they're well cared for. Look for unkept lawns, gardens, broken appliances, cracked ceilings, visual trash. Those are red flags, and that's not going to be a good fit for you, or for, I'm sorry, for the actual newcomer. Next slide. So we're going to go into, I'm going to just do a brief overview of an inspection. This is a good thing to use to kind of determine if it's a good fit for, to sign up with this actual landlord. The first thing is to do the check for safety features. Are they working? Safety features such as fire alarms. This is if you're on the property, you're doing an actual walkthrough. Fire extinguishers in the hallway. Look at the common areas. Do the common areas have smoke and carbon monoxide detectors? According to the National Fire Alarm and Signal Code, smoke detectors should be in every bedroom or outside each separate sleeping area and on every level of the home. And this includes the basement. So if the landlord complies with the smoke detector requirements, when I used to do a walkthrough, it made me know that they took their tenants' safety seriously when I did that. Thermostat, is the thermostat is working order? So how do you know if it's broken? For examples, turn it on to see while you're there doing the walkthrough with your newcomer. Does the AC pop on? Did the heater pop on? Also check for adequate water pressure and temperature when you're going through before you determine if you want to lease up with this landlord. Make sure there's hot and cold water in the kitchen, in the bathroom. Also check appliances while you're there. If the landlord's providing the appliances, test them. Just make sure they're in working order. For example, test each burner on the stove. Make sure that the oven is clean. Does it heat up? Also check the refrigerator. Make sure it's sealing when you shut it. Is the freezer, is it working? Make sure that it's getting cold. And also make sure there's no lingering smells. Next slide. Check the plumbing. Next slide, Grace. There we go. When doing a tour, you can check the plumbing by looking underneath the sinks, around the toilet stools, dripping water or leaks. One thing I used to do when I checked the bathroom, I would flush the toilet, and if it was still running when I left, I'm thinking, okay, that's going to be an issue. Is it leaking? Assess the windows and doors, check the doorknobs, test all the door locks to make sure they work, try all the windows. You don't want any egresses, because the last thing you want to do, you have a newcomer rent into a unit and there's an emergency and they can't get out the windows or the doors. So that's one thing you would look for. Also, my biggest things are tripping hazards. Is the carpet and tile, are they properly installed? This tells you a lot about a landlord. Not only is there, I also look, is there adequate lighting in stairwells, in parking lots? It does prevent trip falls, but my one concern is I want to make sure when I lease someone up, they're going to be safe. That can be a safety issue if there's some blind spots. And another big thing we're going to talk about, which is not very pleasant, is the mold and mildew. Mold is the most common source of air quality problems in living spaces, and it can be difficult to detect since it hides in hard to see spaces such as walls, ventilation ducts, and crawl spaces. But there are some things you can do when you're with your client, when you're actually walking through a unit to determine if they want to lease it up. Does it smell earthy when you walk into the actual unit? Even though you can't sometimes see mold, but mildew and mold, it does have a certain smell to it. So check for smells of a unit. Also, if you see something that might be suspicious of mildew, mildew is powdery and has a downy texture to it. Inspect for black or dark spots on the walls and ceilings. You should also check for mold around tubs and underneath sinks. And I know I'm getting into the nitty gritty, but I think this is so important to know these things. Next slide. Okay, and below is a list provided by the Green Orchard Group on how to check for signs of mold. And as you can see, we talked about that. Look for discolored areas on wall, ceilings, and moldings. Look if there's peeling on the wallpaper. If you see some peeling, look behind that. Look if there's damp carpets, fabrics, look for those things. These things can be kind of to let you know there's some mildew and mold. And as you can see, this is just a brief overview of what that looks like. And I'm not going to get too much detail for time-wise. Next thing, Grace. And another thing, look for power. A rental property should always have power on when you inspect it, even if it's unoccupied. Without power, you can't test fans or appliances or even properly inspect dark rooms. So that's the thing. I would make sure that if you're going to do a walkthrough and a tour of a potential property with a newcomer, make sure, ask them, is your power on? Because I want to see everything in that unit. We want to make sure everything works. Usually when I would do a walkthrough with a client before they leased up, I would bring a charger to make sure all the outlets work and plug my charge in. So that's one thing you can do. I'm going to go into one of the unpleasant things. We're going to talk a little bit about bed bugs. People don't even know this. Bed bugs can live in an empty unit for months, and people don't know that. It's important to check for their presence. Last thing you want to do, you find a great place for an actual newcomer, and it has bed bugs. Can you back that up a little bit, Grace? Thank you. We're going to talk about how you look for fecal stains on moldings in outlet covers. So the first picture, as you can see, hopefully you can see that, it's a picture of mouse droppings. The second picture, can you click for me? This is an example of what roach droppings look like. So you want to look for these things when you're touring a property. The next picture, That's what bed bug droppings look like. The next, Grace. And that's an example of bed bug droppings, and that's with the actual shells. So these are the things that you need to look for. If you see these things in a unit, that's not a good fit for a newcomer because it states that there's an infestation going on in the unit. One thing you need to know, go back, Grace, we're almost there. I'm going to finish up. I'm looking at my time. I'm sorry there. I get so passionate about this piece because I want to make sure people have the tools they need to vet properly. One thing I always will do is if I got a rush tour, if the tour should not be rushed, but it also should have a natural flow. If possible, it should start with the front entry of the kitchen to the living room area, bedrooms and bathrooms. And a reputable landlord will have a smooth tour with ample time to showcase the property and also answer your questions as a volunteer and sponsor and the newcomer questions. Now, if you have, there's a difference when there's a time constraint, don't get me wrong. But if you see that a landlord is potentially rushing you through a tour as you're asking questions and you're going over your inspection checklist, that is a red flag, okay? So that is the way you can vet, because if you're asking too many questions, you're looking at detailed things like I'm showing you, then they're trying to hurry and get you out of the unit. That is something you should take a note. Also do an after-hour tour if you feel comfortable. An after-hour tour during the weekend, that tells you what truly goes on in a property. It tells you what goes on when it comes to the noise, the traffic, if there's parking issues. If anything unpleasant happens, it happens after hours. Again, that's something you can do if you feel comfortable enough doing it, because sometimes properties look great during the day, but you see a true property after hours. Okay, next slide. The United States, we are facing a housing crisis. And according to the recent GAP report published by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the market is short 7.4 million in affordable housing units. And guess what? The most affected are vulnerable populations. And because of the demand for affordable housing, applicants must be cautious of unethical landlords who want to prey on vulnerable applicants or applicants are unaware of their rights. This is how you know. We're going to go over before you have a newcomer sign a lease, because you need to, again, this is an actual legal document they're going to be held accountable for. You need to know if this lease is a predatory lease or are they doing predatory practices. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So unscrupulous landlords, they do prey on people in desperate situations or those who are unaware of their rights. A lot of newcomers, again, they're new to the US market, rental market, so they sometimes don't even know their rights. Before they sign a lease, they should know what is considered predatory terms and practices. And also to prevent them, for you as a sponsor, this helps you prevent them from entering into a landlord, we call them landlord favorable leases. So you're asking yourself, what is a predatory lease? It is a lease that is either borderline illegal and it takes advantage of the renter, or is a legal lease with contractual terms that are unfair to the renter. So we're going to go over some of those. Next slide. The first thing you have to, we're going to talk about some examples of predatory leasing. There's no unit to inspect. Now, if a landlord won't allow you to view the rental before signing a lease, that is a major red flag. Now it's different if you're, like you said, you're working, you find out that a newcomer is coming and you have to get a home, secure a home and lease them before they actually get here and set it up. That's different. But do not lease up a unit without touring the unit first. Because I do know sometimes, like even me, when I moved out of state, I looked at a unit. Well, I didn't actually physically look at the unit, but guess what? I didn't sign that lease till I actually walked through that unit and physically seen it. So if they're requiring you to sign a lease before physically reviewing that unit, that's a predatory practice. You could be entering into a predatory lease. The landlord offers no written lease. Even though a verbal lease is indicative of predatory practices, and is sometimes in some states it's acceptable, there can be problems with that, because again, when a landlord-tenant dispute happens, guess what? If there's no written lease, it's going to go in the favor of the landlord. If the landlord is pressuring your newcomer to sign a lease without reading it, A landlord that pressures the applicant to sign a lease without reading it, that is a red flag, because again, this is a legal document. Another red flag is if they are hesitant to answer questions regarding the lease, or they state that the unit will rent quickly. Well, hurry up, you need to sign on the dotted line because it's going to lease up very quickly. Again, I just want to keep saying it. A lease is a legal binding contract. So a reputable landlord will give a potential applicant ample time to review the lease and address any questions during the application process. And if you find that there is a language barrier, a reputable landlord will allow that newcomer to have an interpreter there to interpret the lease. If a landlord requests post-dated checks, post-dated checks, they can ensure that a tenant pays rent. However, if a landlord requires multiple post-dated checks before moving in, that could be a questionable practice. It allows a landlord to withdraw money from their account at any time. Another thing, if there's no income, they don't require no income reference or background checks or any type of paperwork. That's an issue. I know there's a lot of barriers newcomers have with their alternative documentation. It may be tempting to lease up with the actual landlord who does not require documentation. I would not recommend it. That's not a legitimate landlord. One thing is, if it's too good to be true, if the price is too good to be true, that's a red flag. We call it bait and switch. This is a big red flag when a landlord posts a picture of a unit to bring you in to pique the interest, but when you get there, that unit's not available and it's a totally different unit. That is actually a red flag as well. Next slide. We're almost there. If the landlord requests an unusual large deposit, security deposits, there are legal limits on the amount a landlord can collect, and that depends on your state by state. But the common practice is 1 month's rent, with some landlords charging an additional amount due to an applicant's credit or rental history. Now, a predatory deposit will require a tenant to pay an unreasonable amount of money that puts a financial burden on the applicant. If the lease mentions any kind of mold, that is a red flag. The landlord asks an applicant to wire money or pay cash. Again, red flag. If the lease states that the tenant is responsible for all damages and repairs, a tenant must by law leave the property in the same state he or she finds it in before moving. A lease that states that the tenant is responsible for all damages, this is a predatory practice. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is the late fee. Is it unreasonable? Even though a client plans on being a good tenant, things happen and sometimes they're unable to pay their rent on time. However, if a reasonable rate is under 5%, and if the landlord is charging more than 10% for a late fee, that is totally a red flag, and that should be outlined in the lease. So the next slide. Okay, Derek, I threw a lot at the audience. I know this was a lot of information. I try to respect the time. However, after reviewing this information and you're like, okay, this is a lot, and after Derek sends out the recording, feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at lpearl@cwsglobal.org, or you can go to our website and you can book a one-on-one TA session with me. I've done that before after my trainings. I break down some of the trainings or any questions you may have. So again, Derek, I'm sorry, I try to stay within time, but this is kind of my passion when I think about to make sure it's a good fit and make sure people have the resources they need to vet, because right now there's a lot of unscrupulous landlords out there taking advantage of a lot of newcomers.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lynette. No apologies needed at all. I really appreciate this informative presentation. And, usually at this time, we have a little bit of time before the end to begin answering any questions that may have been submitted. I don't see any in there yet, but as I'm talking here and over the next minute or two, if you do have any questions, please feel free to include those questions in the questions box, and we'll try to address them before we end. Yeah, so we'll just wait here for just a minute, just to see if anyone has any questions. But One question that came up for me, you know, you were talking about those sort of different classes of rental properties. Is there sort of an official agency that is making that determination, or is it how does that come about? I was just curious.
Please forgive me because I've been out of real estate. It's called the Real Estate Assessment Center. They do those classifications.
And
And that's over.
is that something that that like has to be posted by the landlord or anything like
No,
that? How would
it doesn't.
someone know whether or not they're sort of looking at a Class C or a Class D property? Just
You
curious.
can research it. Usually they'll tell you, but also you can ask the landlord itself and they will tell you what the classification is.
Okay.
Again, I don't want people to be stuck. Oh, it's a Class A, it's prime
Yeah.
property. These are just tools you can use. And I use the classifications as a way to negotiate rent when I was a housing specialist. So I'm like, how are you going to be a C property and you're asking for $1,500? You know, when I'm looking what's comparable around the area with other Class C properties, and they're only asking for $900 in rent. So it was kind of a negotiation thing I would use to try to determine, is this a rent reasonable for this particular property? Again, even though it might be C, I would actually when I did the tour with my client, and it was very well kept. I'm like, well, I can see why they're asking this amount of rent.
Sure.
So it was just a tool I just threw in there to use. Yes.
Sure. And then just as a quick follow-up again, because I don't see anyone else with any questions, which is totally fine. But I did see someone put in, yeah, okay, never mind. Let me get to their question here. They're asking, approach a landlord if the refugee has no work history or is still looking for a first job. They're asking, you know, how to do that or how to address that issue of, you know, that the refugee, the newcomer, has no work history or is, you know, still looking for that first job. How do you approach that, or how do you find a good fit with a landlord if, when when the client that you're working with doesn't have that history?
Well, part of that is educating them on the resettlement process and what you do as an organization, your role as a volunteer sponsor or a resettlement staff member, because they do receive financial assistance from the resettlement agency. That's why we have in one of our toolkits an example of a landlord of support, a letter of support. And part of that letter of support breaks down how much financial assistance, not just the financial assistance, but the support they receive in general from the resettlement staff, the volunteer, and the actual sponsor. So a lot of, well, not a lot, but some landlords, they just need to be educated. I just did a workshop last week with 20 landlords, and they were on board. They thought, well, we didn't know. We just thought, okay, you just want us, we want to know how they're going to pay the rent, because again, their end goal is to get their rent paid. So after they saw that, okay, there is financial support, not just financial support, but if I have an issue with this tenant, there's actually a sponsor and a volunteer I can go to that's going to provide me support as well as a landlord. So you have to sell them on the services that you're going to provide them as a landlord as well, but also talk about what support that newcomer is going to have to be successful, because your job is not to put them in a unit for them to fail. So that's how I would approach a potential landlord. And it'd be a good fit for them because they're going to receive support that they wouldn't receive from a traditional tenant. Because if you have a regular tenant who doesn't, say they're not a newcomer and they can't pay their rent, the landlord has nobody to call, but they can call the volunteer, the sponsor, or the resettlement staff member, and they can have support.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lynette. And so we can, in a follow-up email to everyone, we can also include, obviously the link to Refugee Housing Solutions website, but also that sort of one pager that you were just discussing, sort of tip sheet, or what did you call it? I'm sorry.
Oh, tip sheet. It's not out yet, but we are working on, we do have a landlord and a tenant toolkit. So we do have those on our website, but we are working on a toolkit, how to recruit and retain landlords. And that is one of the biggest things I found in TA. A lot of people, how do I get a landlord on board what we're doing, especially when I have a client with no rental or credit history. And that's going to be part of that toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynette. Okay, yeah, unfortunately that is all the time that we have, but yes, thank you. Thank you, Lynette, so much for being here and for your informative presentation. Thank you to everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. We would like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn, and to hear your suggestions for any future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask that you take a moment now to complete a survey. You can use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat, and we look forward to hearing from you. Everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as any other important links, to additional resources. On behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Lynette.